Hello and welcome to Pod of the Gaps, the podcast which brings you all you need to know, all you may want to know or not want to know about sourdough, about banter, and hopefully about the intersections between church culture, theology, mission apologetics, and everything in between. I am Aaron Edwards, and I'm joined as ever by Andy Bannister and Michael Otts, apologists and evangelists extraordinaire. How are you guys doing?
Yeah, that sounds extraordinarily complimentary. Yeah.
Well, it was intended to be.
It could be positive or negative, couldn't it? It could be extraordinary because of the amazing skills the Lord has gifted you with, or it could be extraordinary because nobody has messed things up in quite the same way as Bannister and Otts. So you can use,
That's true. It's an ambiguous
Hindenburg
adjective.
was extraordinary. The Titanic was extraordinary. Billy Graham was extraordinary. So decide for yourself which category.
Well, that's it. It's a veiled compliment. Exactly. I don't even know what the plural of extraordinaire would be, because it's usually an extraordinaire would be, I don't know, one person, but I don't know. We'll have to work on that. We'll have to listeners can send in. We've had discussions about plurality of evangelists being, what is it? A pronouncement of evangelists is what we had one listener.
And a confusion of theologians, I think.
Confusion of theologians. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, superb. So how you guys? What's been new with you guys?
Good, yeah. Well, I've been hiking in the Lake Districts this weekend. So we had a bit of sun, we had a bit of rain, we had a bit of thunder, we had a bit of lightning, a bit of hail, like pretty much standard Lake District weather.
Yeah.
And we even occasionally saw a bit of a mountain as well between the mist and the rain. So that was great.
Yeah. Excellent.
Well, we're the other way around because we are preparing to take the family camping on the weekend. I have two small people in the house who think camping in Scotland is the most exciting thing. My wife and I are like, rain, midges, whatever. My 8-year-old and 6-year-old think this is utopia. So on Friday afternoon, we shall pack the tents up, drive an hour and a half up the road to the mountains. And if you never hear from us again, you will know the midges were really bad that weekend.
Well, I was going to say, Andy, if extraordinaire can be an adjective that has like both double and negative implications, then exciting camping could also be
that's true.
in one of two ways.
It's funny you say that. I remember my time in Canada. I lived in Canada for 6 years, and it was teaching Canadian friends out there the strange way that British English works, right? Because to a Canadian, to a North American, exciting means it's great. I say, no, that's not what it means in British English. If someone comes to you and says, I've got a great plan, I've got a great idea, and you go, that's an exciting proposal. Of course, those of us who are Brits know that doesn't mean you should go.
Well, that's interesting is one of them. That's interesting.
Is another. Yes, you really must come to dinner. That's another sort of, So yes, English has this way, doesn't it? Of saying
I bucked the British trend once because I met someone at a research thing in I was in the US and in Minnesota, kind of at the Kierkegaard Library. I was there doing a kind of summer fellowship years ago, and there's a fellow student there was saying, "Oh, whenever you're in Chicago, you must come and stay." Clearly doing it in the normal way, but he's an American doing it in a British way. And I was like, literally, I'm actually going to a conference in Chicago in November, and so I emailed him, "Hey, that chat we had over a book? Please can I come and stay with you? Because I don't actually have anywhere to stay, and it's very expensive to stay in a downtown hotel." And he wasn't even there, so his parents put me up. So this person I'd only met like once. His parents were putting me up in Chicago for the time, so it's quite good. So I think you should take people up on their offers.
Yeah, and the conclusion to that, I guess, this could be a link to where we're going to go, right? Is the meaning of words is quite important, right?
That's very good. You're not supposed to do the segue for the host, Andy. I mean, that's
actually you're hosting, aren't you? Okay, so you
exactly. Yeah, I've always actually thought about the meaning of words as being really important.
That's a good link.
And that links in to our topic for today, which is. What is our topic for the day? It's what's the problem with same-sex marriage? So if we've hooked you in with a title, are we saying, hey, what's the problem with same-sex marriage? Or what's the problem with same-sex marriage? Who knows? You're about to find out on Part of the Gaps when we dive into this question. Now, of course, in our last episode, we discussed how to destroy a denomination, the nice pithily titled episode, where we discussed Methodism's recent decision to accept same-sex unions, but not only to accept same-sex unions. And one of the issues we discussed, was what does this do to marriage? Or we began to discuss, and that's what we're going to be getting into properly today. And I'm just going to read out a quote from the Methodist report, which was a long report. the whole conference report, I believe, was 982 pages.
That's
Which
more than the number of Methodists in the UK, isn't it? Oh, no, that's right.
almost. That's kind of how you think. Do churches need conference reports of almost 1,000 pages in length? I don't know. Maybe that should suggest something of an issue anyway. But obviously, we've discussed the need to. There's our contingents within Methodism who are kind of staying within it as evangelicals, saying, well, actually, this is no different. It's just saying we're accepting there's two ways of seeing this, and we're trying to stay in partnership and focus on the gospel, this kind of thing, even though we disagree on these things. That's kind of the line that's been taken at present. But here's the paragraph that stood out to me. The church recognizes that the love of God is present within the love of human beings who are drawn to each other and who enter freely into some form of life-enhancing, committed relationship with each other, whether that be through informal cohabitation or a more formal commitment entered into publicly. And for me, that phrase, through informal cohabitation or a more formal commitment entered into publicly, it does something to how we see and think about marriage. It suggests that marriage is not only optional, but even when you do it, it's a mere just a mere public formal arrangement almost. And I had an experience of this recently. Many of you will have been, I'm sure, listeners and you guys here, to weddings which are now kind of secular weddings or agnostic weddings, as it were, just sort of separating out the kind of religious element, but maintaining lots of the rituals. So they're often lovely occasions. You can get together with family, but the actual the registrar becomes the vicar. And I was in one just last weekend, and actually the registrar was very charismatic, actually much more exciting, interesting than a vicar would be. That it wasn't in a church, it was one of these venues where everything was there, the kind of lovely little church-like, pew-like setup, but it wasn't a church. And all of the talk was about how wonderful it was to make these vows to one another, and most importantly, she said, in the presence of you guys here. And I was thinking, oh, you didn't say in the presence of God. He doesn't need to be part of this. But most importantly, you guys are here. So it's this public, formal arrangement which can be entered into. Is there something here in how we've enabled and supported and allowed same-sex marriage as a society, or as a church, as some denominations have, that actually ends up eroding what marriage is? What do you guys think about that?
Well, I want to begin by saying I think you're right. Eroding is a good word. I mean, one of the things, a couple of things that strike me in the story you told there, both the story of the secular wedding and also what the Methodists unwittingly did in their doorstop of a report, is that it begins subtly in some cases and less subtly in others, making marriage an individual thing. And I think there's something about marriage that for marriage to be married properly, and I think we'll come on to that question as we go through the show, right? Doesn't have to be a communal thing. It's not good enough for you and the person you love, be it someone of the opposite sex, the same sex, a bridge. I say a bridge because we were joking around before the show began that there is actually a woman. I thought it was in the States because a lot of strange things happen in the US. I must apologize to Americans. She was an Australian lady who married a bridge a few years ago. We'll put links in the show notes just so you could actually follow the story up and see. I'm not making this up. But if marriage simply becomes you can marry whatever you want, however you want, it's just this individualistic thing, and I think then it lacks any connection to community building, which is a big part of what marriage is. I think marriage has always been designed historically, not just in Christian marriage, but marriage generally, as a crucial building block of society. But for that to work, it has to be a recognition that you're part of something bigger, not just something you've invented yourself. And I think we live in an age.
And that something bigger can't be the architectural structure you've actually married yourself to.
No, I mentioned also before the show. I'm halfway through reading the book, The Unbroken Thread by Saurabh Amari, who's an Indian guy, emigrated to the States, eventually became a Christian, and he's got a fascinating chapter in there on why it's not okay to be, quote, spiritual but not religious, and he talks about ritual in there. There's something about ritual, and of course marriage is a ritual, that a ritual just can't be something you've made up. Just like with spirituality, it's lovely if you get the warm fuzzies by every Friday night, you lie back in your rosemary scented bubble bath, light a candle, have a glass of wine, listen to panpipes. That's great, and if that's lovely for you, so be it. But it's not ritual because it's not connected to others. It's not connected to something actually kind of bigger than you with some degree of authority. It's not connected to the community, and it's not connected chronologically through time, and then it loses all the power that ritual has. And the funny thing is, you don't have to be a Christian to recognize that. He quotes lots of anthropologists who've done work on ritual, and that ritual functions in terms of community building when it's got those attributes. And I think what we're seeing with marriage right now is marriage becoming totally individualized.
I think picking up on that, a couple of things that I've noticed over the last year that kind of reinforce this idea of where marriage has gone is one kind of most recently was when Matt Hancock was revealed to have seems to have an affair, and that obviously led to ultimately to his resignation, although he kind of tried to hang on for a while. And when he was trying to hang on, one of the things that was said about it was, well, this is just a private affair. It's just, it's not importance. It's not affecting his job and so on. And then someone very helpfully tweeted about it. They said, well, if Matt Hancock wants his relationship to this woman to be seen as to the woman who was his wife to be seen as a private affair, he shouldn't have made public vows of commitments. So it's this kind of idea we make, marriage is meant to be public. It's something you do before others, and yet functionally in the way that we treat it, we kind of made it kind of it's just me and this other person, doesn't affect wider society. Although I think, as we'll see kind of sociologically, there are massive implications for the breakdown of marriage more generally upon society. I think the other thing was when lockdown happened for quite a few months, like weddings were totally banned in the UK. And that eventually kind of changed, and even till like almost now, it's been kind of limited in terms of how many people can go and that kind of stuff. And which is funny for us actually, because we were originally planning to get married in May last year, which would have not happened. So thankfully, we, not knowing why, moved our wedding forward to January, got it in. But we had other friends who were trying to plan their marriage in June last year, and it was interesting. They were really getting frustrated that they weren't able to get married. And one of the government ministers, I can't remember who it was now, was asked, why are you not going to open up marriages? And his words were to the effect of, I'm sure we'd all like to have a party right now, but we've got a pandemic on. In other words, what is marriage? It's basically an excuse for a big party. It's just another kind of thing that you do in life. No kind of sense that actually no, this is bigger than that. And even if we could only have 3 people present, this is still an important thing. So I think there are signs like this that show that marriage already has kind of massively slipped from kind of biblical understanding of what marriage is all about.
That's really good. Yeah, that's really interesting. As I say, it's really interesting looking at the way that politicians like Matt Hancock are, or British politicians. For those who aren't familiar with British politics, our Australian listeners, married to bridges or not, may be appreciative of.
Our listenership spans a wide range, isn't it? Spans it.
Nicely done. Yeah. Of course,
I was waiting in suspense for that pun.
There must. I was thinking that Andy must have 10 or 12 puns.
You'll get over it.
We can spring from one pun to another.
That's it. Water under the bridge, all the rest of it. So what was I even saying? Yeah, that was it. So the way that politicians often cart their morality publicly when it suits them. So obviously, it's seen as a good thing to be married with children. Because it shows that you're stable. They know that, and the PR people who support politicians know that. They know that it communicates something to society, that marriage and children are a good thing for society and something to be emulated, something that they hope will kind of catch on, if not already. And yet, when it goes against someone, when there's a divorce or when there's an affair, it's like, as you say, Michael, it's a kind of private affair, and we can just take away that public nature of it, which is so ludicrous, isn't it? And we even had. Who was it? Was it which bishop was it? The Church of England bishop who tweeted. I think he said in a kind of Zoom interview that it was just a bit of a fling. So it doesn't.
Yes, I think the Bishop of Manchester, but
right.
Double check. Yeah.
Incredible, yeah. And so you see the way in which morality can be picked up and put down and chosen at will here or there, depending on what the kind of flavour of the month is. So there's clearly something here, isn't there, where we've lost the foundations for what marriage actually is societally, as well as in the church. This is where it's kind of, for many years, we've known that in society it's been sliding. The wedding industry is bigger than ever. Well, not during COVID, as you say, but it's been, huge sums of money spent on weddings. But that marriage is held in very low esteem, and divorce rates are kind of through the roof consistently in Western society, specifically, as you say, so due to the individualism which has been fostered. My wife and I remember going on a kind of getaway somewhere in Scotland, in our time in Scotland, in our sort of our equivalent of Siberia, we could call it, Andy. It was it was interesting. We were the only. I used to get these deals where we'd get that. I thought, oh, this is a really good deal at this hotel, but it would be because you're the only non-wedding guest at this hotel. And so there's actually a wedding going on, and people are like up till like 3 a.m. It's like, oh, that's why it was like a third of the price of normal. But it was weird to go to these. It happened to us a couple of times, and you sort of observe a wedding from outside of it, and in both cases they were non-Christian weddings, and it was just kind of really sad. This was a couple who would have lived together for 7 or 8 years beforehand. There's no sort of anticipation or build up to like what it is for them to come together for the first time sexually. That was all kind of gone. You can almost see we were having breakfast the next day where the bride and groom were just there, just in their normal clothes, on their phones, you know, probably tweeting about the wedding or whatever over breakfast, not even talking to each other. And it's like now for both of them, usually especially for the bride, it's going to be a complete come down. And it's going to be like, oh, this was the build up to everything in our relationship. And so often it is the case that with cohabitation, the divorce rate goes up significantly. So it's really interesting how all of these ideals that we've sort of held on to as a society, because of the Christian moorings, have been taken away. But people still like the big party element, but they don't like the whole steadfast commitment, covenant before God kind of stuff. Is there kind of what do you think? How can we respond to this as the church when we've got our own problems anyway?
Yeah, I mean, isn't one of the issues we're dancing around here, Aaron, as I hear describe that and reflect on what Michael and I said? I mean, one of the issues here is we need to figure out what the word marriage means, right? Because I think, we joked at the start about the importance of words. Words really do matter. My last book, to give a totally shameless plug, the Muslims and Christians worship the same God, came out of the recognition that everyone's using the word God in all kinds of ways, but we're not stopping to go, what do we mean by it? And marriage, we all assume that when, two friends at work who've been cohabiting for 9 years decide they're going to get married and have a big party, and they say, oh yeah, we're getting married, that means the same as a Christian couple. Or, to be fair, those in other faith traditions. Actually, it's not just Christians who have a high view of marriage. We've got a particular theology of marriage, but we're not the only ones who think that actually there is something more significant to marriage than just an excuse for a knees up. So I think there's a crucial question here around what the word marriage means. And this, of course, ties into the whole same-sex piece, because I think you can't get away from the fact that in the Bible, however you try and dance around it and, distract people with, oh, quick, look over here's a squirrel, while there's an unfortunate passage text that's embarrassing to your case. Jesus in particular, is incredibly strong on marriage, takes those two passages from Genesis, God created them in the beginning, male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his family and cleave to his wife, etc. So Jesus is very clear what marriage is. Well, then the question becomes, can we just change the ingredients and it still be marriage? In philosophy, we use the phrase ontology to describe the nature of something. And so if the nature of marriage, or certainly one of the aspects that makes a marriage is difference in the sexes, in the terms of the partners who make it up, I'm not sure we can just change those around and still have the thing at the end. In the same way that if you take two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom and bang them together, you get a molecule of water. H2O is the formula for water. That is ontologically what water is. But if you decide to come over all progressive and say, well, actually, you know what, I think we can use 3 oxygen molecules. I think we don't need a hydrogen kind of thing. We can just bung together 3 oxygen molecules. Well, you may get something very interesting and potentially explosive, but you're not going to end up with water. And in the same way, I'm not actually sure that we can just shuffle the ingredients around, again, treating human beings like interchangeable Lego bricks, and still end up with the same thing. Now, there's a lot more to say about what marriage is from a Christian perspective, but I think starting there with the question, what actually is it? Is marriage a thing? Or I suppose if you're a secular person, you might say, well, it's just a piece of paper, just a social convention. Well, that's fine. But in which case, then you can marry a bridge or marry 4 people or redefine it any which way, because there is no substance to it. And what's interesting, if you go that route, I remember early on in the same-sex marriage debates, people who are pro-same-sex marriage saying, why are heterosexual couples getting upset? Same-sex marriage doesn't affect your marriage. Well, it does, because if what you've done ends up changing the nature of marriage from being an actual concrete thing into being just a piece of paper or a social convention, and if same-sex marriage has achieved that culture wide, then I'm sorry, actually, same-sex marriage has totally redefined marriage for everybody.
Yeah, so, and I'll just, Michael, I'll let you understand in 1 second. Just a couple of things to respond on that, Andy. I had a conversation with a student a couple of years ago, anticipating what Methodism would decide on same-sex marriage, and this guy was a Methodist. He described himself as same-sex attracted, in a kind of close spiritual friendship with another same-sex attracted man, living in the same house, and but he didn't believe that same-sex marriage was biblical. So he said, I think it's not. There's no biblical case for same-sex marriage. I said, that's interesting. What will you do when Methodism inevitably votes for same-sex marriage, as it will do in a couple of years' time? He said, well, yeah, we'll probably get married, but it won't be married. It'll just be easier to get stuff, things that we'll do. We'll probably just get married, but we won't think of it as marriage in our heart. And I was like, this is kind of going the kind of the disconnect between language and reality about what things actually are. It is really gone a bit crazy in this situation, because you just think, how many acts can you commit with your word, the words you speak, or the kind of signature you sign somewhere, or what you do with your body, perhaps, that you don't think is really happening. This isn't really happening. We're publicly agreeing to be married in the sight of other people, in the sight of the state, in the sight of our church. We just won't think it's really marriage. I just think it's an incredible elasticity that I guess develops, which obviously in the end would just be, they would eventually go, actually, maybe there is a way to see this biblically, that the scholar will help us out. Or that, inevitably, that is what would happen. But it's just amazing the lengths to which we will go to kind of create flexibility for ourselves, isn't it? And there's one other thing I just mentioned on the Matthew 19 thing that Andy mentioned. Jesus' really clear teaching on marriage and divorce. When the Pharisees ask him, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? He starts off by accentuating male and female, which he doesn't have to do. You could be like, Jesus doesn't have to say that in that kind of society. I think they all know that same-sex marriage isn't like a thing. I know there are examples of like Nero taking a male husband almost as a kind of ostentatious show of his kind of grandeur, whatever, but it's clearly not seen as a norm in any way. And he says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And then goes on, therefore his father is a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And that one fleshness is the difference of male and female that God has gloriously created different, coming together in that one flesh union. And so it's really, really significant, isn't it, that Jesus himself actually draws attention to the male and female coming together, and not just two human beings coming together who love each other very much and are drawn to each other, whatever. Sorry, Michael, you were going to jump in.
No, I was going to go back to something Andy said, which was, he talks about what does marriage signify, and actually the word signify is really important, isn't it? Because the whole point of marriage in the Bible is that it's symbolic, and this is something I've often tried to bring up when I've been kind of explaining this in a kind of secular context in university, because people would often say, like, why are you Christians so obsessed with marriage? Why are you so obsessed with sex? It's just another thing, that you do. And actually, one of the things we want to say as Christians is sex and marriage is really important, not just because of what it intrinsically is, a physical thing that we might do with another human being, but because of what it symbolizes. And we're kind of used to that in other areas of life, aren't we? That things will have a value beyond their material value. I remember a friend who got engaged, and they were showing everyone their engagement ring, and they were getting really excited about it, and telling everyone how wonderful it was. And then I asked their now fiance how much they spent on this engagement ring, and I discovered that actually my MacBook was worth more than the engagement ring. And I thought, I don't go around, to all my friends saying, here's my MacBook. Although I do know a few people who have Apple products and tend to do that. But my MacBook has a material value, but that ring has a symbolic value. It symbolizes something more precious than £1,000 or whatever. And in the Bible, we read that actually sex and marriage is symbolic of what ultimately God's relationship is to be to us. And so when we alter the picture, we lose sight of the reality. And so there are certain aspects of marriage which point us towards the gospel, this ultimate story of God's relationship with us. It's a commitment of love. So if a marriage is unloving, then that's a horrific aberration of this picture. It's a lifelong commitment, because it's a picture of God's commitment to us, which is, through thick and thin, nothing can separate us, not of God. But it's also a relationship of people who are different. Just as our relationship to someone in marriage of the opposite sex is in some ways challenging because it's married to someone who is different from us, in the same way our relationship to God is a relationship of difference. And when we change any of those ingredients of marriage, we're not just changing the thing itself, we're losing sight of the thing it's ultimately pointing us towards. I find that really helpful. It's also really helpful because it reminds us that while sex and marriage is really, really important, it is important because it points us to something even more important, if you know what I mean. So then it kind of leads into conversations about, well, what are we then saying to someone who may not be able to get married for whatever reason? And of course, actually what we're saying is we may or may not have the picture, but ultimately we're all invited to experience the reality that it points us towards. So we're not ultimately missing out. But if we make sex and marriage the ultimate, the idol of society, then of course telling someone that for whatever reason that they may not be able to experience that would be far more challenging.
I think that's really, really helpful, just to pick up on something Michael said there. I think we may have mentioned this in a previous episode, but a few weeks ago I read Ed Shaw. Ed Shaw is a friend of ours at Solas and involved with Living Out and so forth. His little book, Purposeful Sexuality, and again we can put a link to this in the show. It's really helpful because Michael, he does exactly what you described there. For folks that don't know Ed, he's part of the group at Living Out. Living Out is an organization for Christians who are same-sex attracted but living biblically faithful lives. And it's interesting watching. I've seen Ed do university sort of talks and things where people will often sort of assume that he must be living this really sad life because he's not experiencing sexual intimacy, and he and others will always say, well, that's actually not the vision of Christianity, that the greatest thing you can do is have sex with somebody. The greatest vision at the heart of Christianity is union with Christ. But in that book's really helpful because he says the church has made some mistakes here, because if we're not careful, yes, there are some things that marriage does and operates as. It does bind together husband and wife. Absolutely, it's for the raising of children, procreation, and the creation of children. Very true. And it's also there for the mutual giving and receiving of pleasure within a marriage, within a partnership context. So the problem with all those three things is they only go so far, and they're also they do exclude people. So if you are same-sex attracted and trying to follow the Bible's teaching, then you are obviously excluded from that. And also, if you're single, that's the other thing in this sex mad culture that we live in. Often when people would sort of say, well, how can Christians, talk about, same-sex marriage not being okay? Because then you're excluding people who are same-sex attracted. I go, well, those of you who want same-sex marriage, you're excluding people who are single. I've got friends and family who are single, and that's been a painful journey. And a world that says, oh yeah, you can sleep with whoever, isn't actually helpful. And Ed says in that book exactly, the church has at times just talked about those three and stopped, but we can't just stop there. We need to go on, as Michael has said, and talk about the fact that sex, the purpose of sex in the Bible, it's designed for this ultimate metaphor of the relationship between human beings and Christ. That it's this great model of God's love for humanity. You see that throughout the scriptures. A number of times where God is portrayed as a husband. Read the book of Hosea in the Old Testament. It's not some sort of modern sort of funky theological idea. It's a core metaphor through scripture, and of course relationship with Christ and the church. And Ed has this lovely line where he says, for me as a same-sex attracted Christian who is, unless something changes dramatically and God does something, then will not be experiencing sexual intimacy, with another human being. He said, that's really not for me a problem. He said, it's rather like, missing the trailer, but still seeing the film. And if you get to go and see, the big movie blockbuster, nobody walks out the theatre going, man, I so wish I'd seen the trailer 6 weeks ago, because you've seen the final thing. There's someone who is a follower of Christ and looks forward to that great union of Christ and his church in the new heavens and the new earth. That's what I'm looking forward to, and that's the picture to which marriage points. And it's totally inclusive because it's for all who follow Christ, whatever their sexuality, whatever their marital status, whatever their age, their background, their ethnicity, and it's incredibly inclusive.
It's funny. It's interesting. That's really, really helpful points, Andy. And I'll just pick up one of those in a second. But actually, just thought as you were saying about the trailer, I wonder how does this analogy work? I quite often enjoy. This is probably weird of me. I quite enjoy watching a trailer after I've watched a film. Is that weird? Because I want to see how it was portrayed. I was like, oh, that was a great film. How was this film portrayed in the trailer? I don't know why that's an interesting thing to me, but I occasionally like.
I sometimes go and watch the Honest trailers. If you haven't come across Honest trailers, they're amazing. No. Which is look that website up. But my version of that, Aaron, is my wife just despairs us. I will, whenever I've bought a product, particularly an expensive product, I bought a new laptop kind of 3 years ago or whatever it is, or I will then go and read the reviews after I bought the product. you know. So I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to achieve, but I'm trying to validate my purchase choices. But yeah, I will often sort of spend a few days going, oh yeah, look at this. I'll read the review of what I've already
Part
bought.
of the product community. That's it. You're just kind of reaching out.
Maybe that's it. Maybe it's
friendly
you
people.
know. I mean, when I bought my remarkable paper tablet, that Michael and I sort of love these things.
Yeah, that's right. I'm never hearing the end of those paper tablets. Goodness me.
I know.
YouTube,
There's
with your
Michael's one.
technology, you've literally reinvented pen and paper by spending more money on a more expensive
But it's
version of it.
Norwegian, so it must be all right.
That's true. It must be right. So I was going to pick up on the more substantive point.
Back to reality.
Back to reality is that now we touched a little bit on this. We have slightly different views on this. I'm of the opinion that we get to same-sex marriage because we've already eroded the difference between men and women as being good, glorious, wise on God's part, because the accentuation of the difference between men and women in how we understand them and perhaps in roles within church and marriage, especially within marriage, that's what gets you to same-sex marriage, because it doesn't matter who is part of this marriage if women do all the same things as men because we're scared of seeming misogynistic if we say otherwise, or seeming that they're not equal in value to men because they can't do everything men can do, and vice versa with women, men and women. Because of our fear of that and our lack of sort of owning what the Bible says on those kinds of things, we actually lose out on representing marriage as it is biblically. And this is something that someone on the LGBT community, you could put that in inverted commas or not, as some gay people don't like that phrase and some do, they would genuinely level the charge against evangelical Christians and say, well, you guys don't even really follow marriage biblically anyway. You're defending the Bible on marriage. But firstly, loads of Christians get divorced and then remarried again. And that seems to be expressly against what Jesus says. And secondly, you don't really follow headship because you kind of embarrass you. You just say, oh, there's a division of labor. I like doing this, or she's better at this. So you don't really follow or observe headship in any way. And in Ephesians 5, 1 Peter 3, other places, it's really abundantly clear that there's, a sort of different dynamic between men and women in marriage. So how do we deal with that? And when we're trying to recover what marriage is and trying to do so biblically, how do we do so with all of that stuff in mind?
I think that's really helpful to bring up. And to just say two things on that, Aaron. I'd say, firstly, I think there can be a danger that we basically, like, as Christians have been like, as long as it's heterosexual, it's fine. As if, like, the only thing that's important about marriage is that it's a man and a woman. And it's like, as we said earlier, there's a whole load of more things there. So, if it's not committed, lifelong, if it's not a marriage of love, of real selfless commitments, those are also destroying what marriage is ultimately meant to point towards. So we're in danger sometimes of just taking one point and forgetting the others. But I think also it's an interesting one in terms of, like, the difference in the roles between men and women. And as you say, I guess theologically, we said last week, I think, that we would probably have a podcast on that because, there are differences of opinion. One of the things that I found quite helpful is that traditionally egalitarians would kind of want to kind of potentially erode any differences there, and basically say everything is pretty much equal. Complementarians would emphasize their differences. I was particularly helped by a book by a guy called Andrew Bartlett, Men and Women in Christ. And he actually took neither a strictly egalitarian or complementarian line. He says actually his feeling is that there are roles that are open to both men and women within church leadership. But he says, and this is interesting, you can't get away from the fact that in the New Testament, there are specific commands that are given to men, not women, and women, not men, in regards to marriage. There is a difference. And so we can't just kind of boil them all down and say they're exactly the same. And that's the way that God has designed it. So I think that's very helpful that actually, even if we're to say, there are certain roles within church leadership that we might open up, there seems to be a real clear differentiation between men and women in marriage and how that should work.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Michael. And obviously, I think the commands are actually just as clear on church roles as they are in marriage. But that's a thing we'll save for another time. For our listeners, they'll be amused, thinking, when is this episode going to happen? When they really go to war with one another? Who knows?
It'll be the last episode. That's why we're frightened. We'll just pull out and never speak again.
We'll call it the apocalyptic part of the gaps. That's it. But yes, but I do absolutely that there's differences in how those things are spoken of, and certainly we can't ignore them, and they are more and more embarrassing to ignore, and so they're often thrown in debates I think I mentioned maybe when I was in the debate with Steve Chalk on gay conversion therapy, one of his kind of throwaway things was, I mean, come on, guys, the church has been wrong about loads of stuff before, about the roles of women and all sorts. And I was like, I'll just keep quiet on this one. I'm even crazier than you think I am, I presume. So this sort of thing, yeah, it is important. I think there is a slippery slope. There's a trajectory here. These things don't happen by accident. Andy, any kind of thoughts off the back of that on how we think about marriage, how we can respond as the church to the issues in society, the changes in society, anything kind of that you can add as a pearl of wisdom here?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure I have much in the way of pearls, and if I had them, would I toss them? No. Referring to you folks, not our lovely audience. I just want to pick up on the erasure of the differences thing. I think that's absolutely. The more I think about that, I think that's hugely important. Just like we said, the meaning of words is important. Sometimes the big ideas behind the scenes, and there's one of the things I think that so often we do as the church is we end up gunning for trying to make a huge noise about what is a symptom, and we don't address the underlying issue. And we've talked in previous episodes about dying on hills and so on. And I think the church did slightly, in some cases, die on the hill of gay marriage in the way we handled that, because we didn't go for the underlying issues. We just went for the surface phenomenon. Because the difference piece in marriage is interesting. I just want to talk about this for a second. Is that in Ed Shaw's book that I referred to a few minutes ago, he's got a fascinating section where he talks about actually the fact that one of the sort of dirty little secrets that's not talked about is that a lot of same-sex marriages run into problems because they don't have difference. And he says, I'm not saying this as a Christian. He quotes numerous gay writers and lesbian writers on this. I'll just read you this and then say one other thing and then hand back. He quotes a chap called Daniel Mendelsohn, a gay journalist, who Ed says puts the case for the importance of sexual difference in sexual relationships best. And he quotes Daniel. Daniel writes, and as far as I know, Mendelssohn's not a Christian. He is himself a gay man. He says, sex between men dissolves otherness into sameness because there is nothing the partner doesn't know about the other. If the emotional aim of sexual intercourse is a total knowing of the other, well, gay sex, I suppose, may be in its way perfect, because in it a total knowledge of the other's experience is finally possible. But since the object of that knowledge is already known to each of the parties, the act is, in a way, redundant. Perhaps it is for this reason that so many of us keep seeking repetition, as if that way depth were possible. And I remember reading that and going, "Struth." One of the things I'm staggered about is how often, from the mouths of those who don't share our Christian convictions, sometimes truth comes. And so I think, there is something about marriage that is designed around difference. And as we quoted Jesus earlier, male and female, not the same, come together. And of course, the image to which marriage is the big metaphor in Scripture that points of Christ and the church, they are not the same. If we start saying, well, same-sex marriage is okay, then maybe we get into our heads that, well, maybe Christ is the church, because we can change those pieces in that great eschatological vision.
Yeah.
In terms of what I was going to say very quickly, in terms of what the church can do, because you asked me that question, Aaron, I think firstly we've got to find our courage and start speaking up, but fighting the right battles, not just going, we think gay marriage is wrong because it's not the way it's ever been done. We need to start talking more clearly about what we think marriage is, telling that bigger, better story. Then I think we need to be modeling what real marriage looks like. And I think the church needs to be doing at times a lot more work in terms of supporting Christian couples and Christian marriage, mentoring, marriage preparation, counseling, support and discipleship. All those things go together, because it breaks my heart that the divorce rate for Christian marriages, it is better than the world. It absolutely is, but it still is a horrifying number, because I think society should look at Christian marriage and see something different. And at times I don't think they do. So I think to start with, finding our voice and finding our courage and really modeling and demonstrating this is what Christian marriage looks like. Not because we think we're better or perfect. And yes, Christians have all the same issues that other marriages have, but this is how we work through them, because underlying marriage is commitment and covenant commitment. It's not all about the warm fuzzies, and that we'll no longer get the warm fuzzies, we throw that partner out and move on. But, marriage is this covenant commitment, till death do us part. And this is what it looks like lived out.
And that's really helpful. And it's really interesting how important that has been in Western society as a kind of cultural heritage of Christendom as well, isn't it? That marriage being a good idea, a monogamous marriage, eroding sort of notions of, of far more abject misogyny and chauvinism than the complementarian would be called today. You think about going talk to the I don't know, the Visigoths or the barbarians of Germania or something before medieval Christendom arrives, for all of the faults you could level at medieval Christendom. But the fact that people like Charlemagne instituted things like marriage as a significant thing within societies has been so important. It's been the bedrock of society, and that's why people sometimes, then some, it's true, perhaps people can idolize marriage, but I'm very dubious when I hear that as an argument as to why you shouldn't die on this hill. Because really, it's not just this hill. It's not really just like we only care about stopping gay people getting married. It seems just you're being really mean. Why wouldn't you do that? Love is love. God loves love. Bless it. Actually, it is the erosion of something far, far more significant and a sacredly important thing as well, as that witness to the church. So in a way, though it's a hill we may not want to die on, Methodism hasn't wanted to die on. That's why they've just had both views and said both are okay. It's actually a hill on which the church could die by not dying on it, if you know what I mean. We're choosing to die. Okay, we're just going to lose our influence. We're going to completely dissolve ourselves into the ether as a result of this. And I remember, even as a theologian, I've seen this for years in theological debates at conferences. I think it was 8 years ago I was at a conference, and the guy arguing for same-sex marriage was then challenged. The Q&A was all about thruples, quadruples, quintuples coming in, and actually saying how outrageous this is because this monogamy is very exclusivist. And of course, that's entirely rational. It's a logical conclusion. I mean, as you said, Andy, earlier, the idea of the bridge and things like this, these things are necessary logical implications. As absurd and stupid as they may seem in a debate, at one level, they become the reality very, very soon, and much sooner than we think. There's a line I saw from a historian, I don't know, I think Kuntz was the name. Within the last 40 years, marriage has changed more than in the last 5,000. And that just always ought to make you stop and think, is this a good idea? Marriage has changed more in the last 40 years than in the last 5,000 years. What are the implications going to be? How does that impact sex? As you mentioned, Andy, the sexual revolution has come in and changed how we think about sex. So it loses that mystery. We lose that difference. We lose that sense of otherness, which marriage, in bringing people together as one flesh, is a wonderful consummation of. As we used to talk about consummating the marriage, it is a wonderful, glorious thing, but it's something that we have let slide in all sorts of other ways. And Michael, any kind of final thoughts on this, and a kind of gospel angle on this on this whole debate, really?
Yeah, before coming back to that from a kind of evangelistic point of view, I guess one of the things I kind of hinted at earlier, I was saying when we damage marriage, there are two dangers really. One is we actually damage society, and that's why we think this is important, because we think actually marriage is a public thing. It does affect the fabric of society. It is good for society, and when we alter that, change that in any way, that has implications. And I think you see it most clearly in bringing up children. I think we're going to start to already, we are starting to see the fruit in a negative way of what we've done in terms of the fabric of society. And I think sadly, sometimes you have to almost see a whole generation come and go before you start to realize, okay, maybe we made a mistake there. So I think from a kind of just a societal point of view, this is detrimental. But again, as I said earlier, I think one of the things is ultimately this points us to something bigger than itself. And I think that's just so helpful to come back to. Why is sex and marriage so important? Because it's a symbol of something more important. And that both means that we treat it as something precious, and it's important how we treat it, but also we don't idolize it because it's pointing towards something better. And it's interesting, often when we talk about idols as, well, they are negative things, but obviously, they're good things often that are distorted. And we're more likely to idolize something that's good than something that's kind of quite obviously bad. So when we idolize marriage, we take the symbol and we lose sight of the reality. And we want to point people back to that. Because actually what I've discovered is that, the Bible's, Jesus' teaching on sex and marriage is massively challenging, whoever you are. Obviously, it would be challenging if you are same-sex attracted. It's also challenging if you're single. I did get married last year, but for 38 years of my life, I was single. It's challenging, but it's also challenging when you're married, because it's still a lifelong commitment of fidelity towards one other person, and that's not going to be easy at times. Jesus' teaching is challenging to everyone for different reasons. It's not like, oh, these people get it easy. It's going to be challenging, but actually it is worth it for society, but worth it for what it points us towards ultimately. And if we don't have the symbol, the beautiful thing is we're all invited to experience the reality, or as Andy talks about, if we don't have the trailer, we can watch the main film. Although, Aaron, I'm sure that you probably would rather watch the trailer by the sound of things, which ruins the illustration somewhat.
Yeah, you guys are all going to be in heaven. I'm going to be like, I'm just going to pop back down to earth and just see the trailer again. That's right. Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Andy, for all your pearls of wisdom as well. And I hope you listeners have found this helpful. If you have, please continue liking, subscribing, all of that normal podcasty type stuff, sharing with those who think this would be helpful, for whom you think this would be helpful. And from all of us, from myself, Aaron Edwards, from Michael Otts and Andy Bannister, farewell.